You're watching a character you followed for seasons, and suddenly they don't feel like themselves anymore. Their fears disappear, their motivation shift, and their trauma stops mattering. Not because they healed, but because the show forgot. Take, for instance, Hopper. Early on in Stranger Things, his anger came from grief, from losing his daughter, from shutting down emotionally just to survive. But later, that same anger gets played for laughs, turned into this exaggerated dad rage. The loss is still mentioned, but the psychology behind it disappears. And when that happens, something breaks. You start to feel distance from the character, like you're watching a version of them and not them. And this isn't just inconsistent writing, it's something much deeper. This is a pattern across modern shows where the stories remember what happened, but forget the meaning behind it. It's known as narrative amnesia. Once you see it, trust me, and unfortunately, you'll notice it everywhere. When heroes become strangers, when villains lose their psychology, and when entire stories can just start to feel hollow. Let's break down why this happens. The first place we can see narrative amnesia is when heroes stop acting or seeming like themselves. Not because they grew, not because they changed, not because they healed, but because the story stopped tracking who they are psychologically. Take Hopper again. Early on, everything about him made sense. His anger wasn't random, it came from grief, from losing his daughter, from years of emotional shutdown. He pushed people away, he self destructed, he protected Eleven like it was the only thing holding him together. That was a coherent psychological profile. And then later, something shifts. The anger stays, but the emotional logic behind it fades. Now it's louder, more explosive, played for comedy, detached from the grief that originally fueled it. And that's the key difference. We're not watching evolution, we're watching exaggeration. When a character grows, their past still shapes them. All of our pasts still shape us in some way. Yes, they're maladaptive coping mechanisms. They might adapt, but they shouldn't just disappear entirely. And their fears should still echo. Yes, maybe it's not such a loud boom and as prevalent as it was maybe when some kind of trauma in their life first happened, but there should still be echoes of it. But when the narrative amnesia kicks in, the past becomes a reference point rather than the actual force that's driving the behavior. And then the character starts to feel unfamiliar. You see it when anxiety driven characters suddenly act fearless, when guarded characters become emotionally open overnight, when trauma stops influencing decisions entirely. And as the audience, we feel it immediately, not in the sense of anger, but in terms of a distance. And the person that you spent seasons understanding, they start to now feel like a stranger. But this is where narrative amnesia can really mess up a story because it doesn't just affect heroes, but it impacts villains too. And when a villain gets completely reshaped, the story now loses its psychological tension. For instance, Joe Goldberg worked in the early seasons of You because his psychology was consistent. He didn't see himself as evil, he rationalized everything and built these elaborate moral frameworks to justify obsession and violence. And since he was our narrator, the show let us sit in these distortions. And because of that, he was so unsettling. But as seasons progressed, his self awareness fluctuates. Sometimes he recognizes his patterns, sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes the show critiques him, sometimes it leans into his charm. The psychological lens becomes inconsistent. And this is such a big issue because a villain is only really compelling when their logic is intact. Meaning, when we understand how they justify themselves and their behaviors, even if we personally reject that logic. But when that logic bends to fit the plot, they lose their center. You see a similar shift with Berlin in Money Heist. Early on, his narcissism and cruelty operate within a clear worldview. He believes in hierarchy, control, and personal codes. But later portrayals soften him, they stylize him, even romanticize him. The psychology gets replaced with an aesthetic. And so the moral tension, it fades. I mean, we're no longer scared of these villains, or they just don't seem as realistic. And here's the crux of the issue. Once heroes start to become strangers and villains lose their psychological anchor, it doesn't just impact the characters, but it starts to destabilize the entire story. Because if the past no longer shapes behavior, nothing truly has consequence anymore. And there's this ripple effect that starts to happen because likely in a story, it's not just one character that this narrative amnesia is happening to, it's probably multiple. And when narrative amnesia is affecting multiple characters, now it's no longer just a character problem, this one character. Now it's a whole story problem because a story is really built on emotional continuity, not just what happened, but what changed because that thing happened. Every major loss, betrayal, or trauma is supposed to reshape the world of the story. It raises the stakes, alters the relationships, changes how characters make decisions moving forward. But when those psychological consequences fade too quickly, the story just loses its weight. And over time, something subtle happens. The stakes stop feeling permanent because nothing seems to stick. When consequences don't shape behavior, we stop expecting them to matter. If any of you did see Stranger Things season 5, for instance, that scene where Steve is about to fall off the building, I in no way, when they cut to black, thought that he was actually going to be killed. I knew for sure he was going to be saved. The consequences, the stakes didn't matter because far too many times these folks were put in dangerous situations and saved. But to get to that point, it's a slow burn. It's not dramatic, it's gradual. And gradually your emotional investment, it starts to erode. But since it's gradual, like you'll still watch, you'll still maybe enjoy parts of it, but you won't have those moments of high stakes where it's like, this moment could really change everything. And I know I'm the psychologist here, but modern audiences are you all are very much psychologically literate. So even if you don't use the specific language, like we still track characters' motivations for what they're doing, moral contradictions, things like attachment patterns and styles. And so we can feel when something changes. That's when we start to say things like, that doesn't feel like this character, or something about the writing has changed, or just this season feels off. Once a story stops honoring emotional cause and effect, the plot then begins to replace the actual psychology. And so events still accumulate, they still happen very quickly, but the emotional weight of it isn't accumulating with them. It isn't escalating with them. And so without this, the kind of stakes just become a spectacle. It's not really a transformation. So how do some shows avoid this? How do they keep their characters evolving without actually erasing who they used to be? And stick around for a little bit later in this video if you want to learn how to start identifying this narrative amnesia when it's happening. I'll give you a checklist of 10 items that you can go through to start to get an understanding of what this might look like. That way you can be on the watch out if this starts to happen with some of your favorite characters and maybe start to emotionally disengage sooner rather than later. So what does the opposite of narrative amnesia look like? What does it look like when a show remembers? Well, a huge thing is they do not treat grief or loss or any of these major events just like some kind of plot point, but rather they treat it as a lens through which the character is looking through. Meaning, it's going to shape how this person sees the world long after the event has ended. Nothing disappears, it just transforms. A great example of this comes from the show Dark, where characters change constantly, but their psychology stays intact. Knowledge reshapes them, loss hardens them, and regret follows them across timelines. But even when their behavior shifts, the emotional reasoning behind it remains visible. You can always trace who they are back to what they've lived through. And that's why the story feels grounded even when the world isn't. And again, as audiences, we are not dumb. We can feel when a character seems rewritten rather than actually feeling layered, right? Like, we understand that healing can be a messy process. And so seeing that versus just an immediate 180 shift, or seeing that progress can and often does include things like relapse. I mean, I talked about, for instance, Hopper, but say people that might manage a really hard loss or even struggling with addiction. How unrealistic to cope with such difficult things in your life by turning to a substance and then all of a sudden never, ever, ever even having any kind of relapse or even showing that you were having some kind of craving to potentially relapse. I mean, it just feels so fake. And things like courage feel more real because it actually has the fear behind it. Courage isn't acting in the absence of fear, but despite it. Yet we often see these characters that just were usually fearful, but run off into a situation without a care in the world or don't seem to have any kind of emotional struggle around it. That doesn't feel realistic. And so doing these things right is what creates that attachment in us to these characters and more to these stories. It's not doing everything perfect, but it's doing everything consistent. So as promised, I'm going to help you figure out how to spot when a show it's forgetting its own psychology. And so this will be the narrative amnesia checklist. This will be 10 things that you can look out for. At the end of the 10 things, I'll just put them all on the screen that you can pause the video, take a screenshot, or of course, you could always save this video and come back to it as much as you would like. So the first thing on the narrative checklist is trauma without residue. So what you want to look for is when a character survives something life altering, but it stops shaping their behavior. So taking for instance 11 from Stranger Things. For the first 2 seasons, she is shown as being hypervigilant, fearful of abandonment, and deeply shaped by her captivity, being locked up and tested on for who knows how long. But the amnesia moment comes in when in later seasons, she repeatedly enters high risk situations without hesitation. There's a minimal fear response and little internal conflict. And why this is a break from what we'd expect is that after experiencing a trauma, your bravery should still have some kind of hesitation behind it, or it should still have some emotional cost. Like when you finish in that situation, there should be emotional weight to what you just did. The fear shouldn't just disappear like it does with 11. The next thing to look for is when emotional reactions don't match the past. And so these are emotional responses that contradict already established attachment patterns. The example that I'll be using for that is Joe Goldberg from You. And I actually did a full video where I talk about attachment styles, including his specific attachment style and how they get started and how that shows up. So if you want information about that, watch that one. But spoiler alert, Joe Goldberg is deeply avoidant in terms of his attachment, and he has obsessive control, a fear of being truly known, all of these things. And his amnesia moment happens where Joe repeatedly convinces himself that he's capable of healthy love without any kind of sustained internal resistance to this. So, why this is a break is that somebody with Joe's psychology, his attachment style, wouldn't just suddenly trust intimacy. What they do is, yes, they would hope, of course, for this love, but they'd actually probably sabotage it accidentally while believing that they had changed in some way, right? So they might think, okay, I'm getting better, I'm doing well, but then sabotage without reason. We see Joe doesn't do that. Like in season 5 with Bronte, he's all in. He's not seeing any signs. He's not trying to sabotage that relationship in any way. He's just fully throwing himself into it, which is unrealistic for what we know about avoidant attachments. And it's not saying people with avoidant attachments can't heal and grow and change, but he's not doing any kind of therapy or any kind of reflection. So it's incredibly unlikely that somebody with his attachment style that isn't doing any active work to try to change it is just magically going to change this. The third thing to look out for is when coping mechanisms magically disappear. And so a character's defense strategies, the original ones, they just vanish under stress instead of actually resurfacing, which is what we would expect. So going back to Hopper, for instance, I talked about this, how he has established in terms of coping as somebody who will emotionally shut down, get angry, avoid. maybe use alcohol after grief. But then in later seasons, his emotional openness, it's kind of like a switch that is flipped. He doesn't really have that much struggle. He doesn't really regress that much. And why this is a break is because real growth includes relapses under pressure. I'm not just talking about alcohol, but just relapses going back to old behavior under pressure. The absence of it just feels like skipping steps. So the fourth thing to look out for is that value shift based on plot convenience. And so you want to look out for characters where their core moral boundaries are just crossed without any kind of reflection about it before they actually do it. So, taking, for example, Money Heist and the professor. So, he has established values of being precise, being able to restrain his emotions, and minimizing unnecessary harm. Yet, the amnesia moment comes in when in later seasons, he's pushed into impulsive, emotional decisions that directly contradict his identity. So, why this breaks is that if our values change, which that happens as people, that's not the issue. Our values definitely, and we do expect them to change, but it's that we should see some kind of internal fracture with this too. There should be some kind of wrestling, some kind of struggle. It shouldn't just be, okay, my values change. Whatever. No big deal. I don't care. We don't just want to see the outcome. We need to see the struggle behind it. And that actually goes into the fifth point. And that would be growth without any kind of inner internal conflict. So that might be like seeing this empowered behavior with no kind of ambivalence, so riding the fence, or no fear of regression. So, taking for instance Clay again in 13 Reasons Why. So, like I mentioned earlier in the video, he's been established as being anxious and ruminative and having this kind of moral hyper responsibility. But the amnesia moments come in where there's periods where Clay becomes decisive or even aggressive without showing any kind of anxiety that would usually come with these actions. So, why it's a break is that growth for anxious characters would still feel anxious, right? Like, anxiety is not just some magic thing that just vanishes. If you are an anxious person, even if you work on it and get better and see these improvements, we'd still expect these bits of anxiety, which we don't see at all with Clay at a certain point. And this kind of confidence without any internal noise, we'll say, it just feels false. The sixth thing to look out for is that repeated lessons just don't stick. That a person has a huge arc and learns all these amazing lessons, but it just basically resets season to season. So, taking again Joe Goldberg, his cycle is that he'll learn, okay, I'm the problem, I'm the issue. But almost immediately, he reframes himself as being justified again. There is no accumulation of this self awareness. It really just feels like recycling the same narrative for the purpose of pushing the plot forward. I mean, we see in that huge scene with Love how he just breaks down and really is able to say, like, I'm the issue. And then almost immediately goes back to his old ways, and the season ends with him having a new person he's stalking, his neighbor, basically just so we can have another season, because how are we going to have another season of You if he doesn't have somebody to stalk? And so I kind of liken it, or I like to call it almost like the Full House effect. If anybody, and it's kind of aging me, I'm a millennial, but if anybody has seen Full House or even like Family Matters or those kinds of like family sitcom type shows, they always have at the end of each episode like a heartfelt moment. Usually when one of the parents, so usually Bob Saget, will sit down with one of the kids and have this like heartfelt moment, right? And you just come to expect it. It's truly amazing to see that there's so many episodes and it happens just about every single episode. You come to expect it like clockwork. So it's like what these resets can feel like. It's like we've gone over this and it's just not sticking ever, which is so frustrating. And of course, some people just can't get certain things through their head. Like, I get that. However, for there to be such strong bursts of self awareness and then to go back to zero, that's not really realistic. The seventh is selective memory of trauma. So, trauma only exists basically when it's relevant, when you want to add some additional weight to the story. So, going to Stranger Things again, there's a lot of people that we can pick, but going with Max, for instance, in her earlier moments, her grief and depression are really handled with care. They do such a good job of showing how her grief is leading her to push people away and to isolate and how she's uncomfortable talking about it. But then the amnesia comes in. In later seasons, you kind of minimize how this grief affects her risk taking, emotion regulation. You just don't get that same impact. Like, I found myself by the time I get to season 5, I was not thinking about her trauma at all. Like, to me, she didn't resemble a traumatized person in the slightest. She was in that world for all this time, completely alone, away from all of her friends, trying to get out of this horrible world that she's in. Like, we'd expect that to trigger those trauma and grief responses for her, but we kind of get nothing. And that's an issue because trauma shouldn't turn off or on depending on the tone of the episode. And that goes into the next point, which is where the relationships also forget the past. So, not just the one character, but other characters stop responding to a person's known vulnerabilities. So, if they know a person has some kind of trauma, they stop basically reacting to them in that way and changing their own behavior based around it. So going back to Stranger Things again, we can think of just in general a lot of the group dynamics. I mean, the characters by this point, they really know each other's triggers and these losses and these limits, but that awareness sometimes just disappears and these relationships can feel reset. And so this signals a relational amnesia. So not just an individual, but even amongst the relationship too. So two more here, we're almost done with the checklist. And that is basically a personality rewrite that can happen and labeling these rewrites as evolution. So you'll see these characters have completely new traits that replace their old one instead of layering on top of the old ones. And so taking, for instance, Money Heist, I already talked about this with multiple people. So like the professor going from being a strategic thinker to now just being completely reckless, or other people who have kind of moral nuance and then they just all of a sudden just go to being completely aggressive. And so what true evolution looks like is expansion. Amnesia looks like replacement. And the last one is what I like to term kind of just a general like gut check. And basically asking yourself, did this feel challenging or was it just straight up confusing? So if you're asking the questions of why would they do that, or saying this doesn't feel like this person anymore, those are good signs that likely there's some amnesia happening. Versus saying, okay, this change hurts or what's happening to this person hurts, but I can understand why they're doing it. That's a sign that likely they're just growing in an appropriate way. The difference is truly everything. And so I'm going to put up on the screen now, I'm going to put an image of the different 10 things that I said on the checklist so you can pause this, take a screenshot, look this over, and, scroll through your phone as you're going through your favorite shows on Netflix and see if some of the characters that you are seeing on Netflix are exhibiting any of these things. And so maybe throughout this video, a couple characters came to mind. I know I mentioned a good bit of people, but maybe some folks came to mind. Would love to hear, if you haven't already typed your comment, of what came to mind, what areas of amnesia you noticed, and just if this stood out to you in a certain way and maybe you finally just got words to speak to this experience you might have already been having.